Major support for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Seen regularly on our roads, there is a construction company with very large dump trucks that have a slogan emblazoned on the back, and it reads, "Building the Carolinas one load at a time." That surely seems poetic. On any given day in almost any of our cities in this region, in general, there seems to be a countless fleet of construction vehicles of all sizes and purposes. Welcome to the most widely watched source of Carolina business, public policy, and public affairs. I am Chris William, and the example of the construction boom going on now is only one case in point of the sustained nature of this economy. Later, Ward Nye, CEO of Martin Marietta Materials, will discuss this, but in a moment, our expert panel kicks it off with this week's dialogue.
Gratefully acknowledging support by Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Barings, a leading global asset management firm dedicated to meeting the evolving investment and capital needs of its clients. Learn more at barings.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Brittany K.J. Brady of the Henderson County Partnership for Economic Development, Carl Blackstone from the Columbia Chamber of Commerce, and special guest Ward Nye, CEO of Martin Marietta.
Welcome to our program. Brittany, good to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Carl, welcome back.
Hey, absolutely.
So, Carl, a lot of debate, a lot of talk about trade, about Trump, about tariffs, and it seems like this has not gone away, but in fact, the administration in Washington has now made it concrete, no pun intended, and done something about it, and China's already responded, and we've seen some back and forth. South Carolina, in particular, has had a very proud trade number. Export business is not higher than it's ever been. Secretary of Commerce Bobby Hitt was here not long ago saying that it was over $32 billion last year. How much at risk is South Carolina in this particular environment of trades and tariffs?
Well, we're sensitive to it. I mean, obviously, with the amount of dollars that we export, China being our largest trading partner, we have 35 Chinese manufacturing companies in South Carolina, all within the last 10 years have called South Carolina home. Samsung in Newberry County just created 600 new jobs in the last year to build washer and dryers. So the impact is real. Whether or not this actually comes to fruition, we'll see. But it's something we have to monitor and closely watch because the impact would be devastating.
Have you heard anything from that particular population or class of those Chinese firms are starting to talk about it in groups?
Yeah, they're aware, obviously, and they're having the discussions now, but it has not, it's just simmering now to see what happens.
Right.
The conversations with Samsung in the last 3 months have been real, whether or not they were going to continue to invest in South Carolina based upon tariffs on washing machines. So the conversation is going to be very feverish.
Could this derail the Samsung expansion?
They've already started.
They've
opened their second line as of in the last month.
Okay.
So they're moving ahead, but they're also watching.
Yeah, sure. Brittany, rural economic development, rural versus urban, this debate. This is another one we always talk about because I think it rhymes so well, and rural-urban development. So in Hendersonville, Henderson County, is it Henderson County?
It's Henderson County,
Yeah,
yes.
Thank you. It's very real when you talk about rural development.
It is.
Do we need to think differently about the way that we approach it? Certainly the Governor Cooper in North Carolina has made that an important point of what he wants to do. But how would you say it living there?
You know, it isn't black and white when you look at rural and urban development. A lot of times folks think that if you're thinking of a major metro area, that there's more prosperity and more resources. In Henderson County in particular, we're very rural. We're in the mountains of western North Carolina. We don't have a major urban area or a major metro, but we have pockets of prosperity. We've seen tremendous growth, not only with our economy, but also with our population. And that makes us a Tier 3 community. And so when you start talking about the tier structure, that becomes a challenge. And is a Henderson County like a Mecklenburg County? Absolutely not, but sometimes we're treated that way.
But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying so Tier 3 would be a Mecklenburg and a Wake County?
That's correct.
In North
and
Carolina?
Henderson County.
And Henderson County. Is it lumped into that because of the ADI would also be Asheville, Buncombe County, Ashe County? Is that why that is?
So it's based on the less, more population is a part of the key, but also how prosperous a community is. So we're less distressed than other rural communities, but we're still rural. We don't have the same infrastructure that a Wake or Mecklenburg would have.
So what do you think is missed when we talk about rural-urban balance in economic development?
You know, it's not black and white. We can't just have the tier structure has improved drastically over the past several years. But again, you have to look at each community and see where resources can be dispersed. I think the idea with the tier system is that the state will support communities that might need help landing a larger project. But communities like Henderson County, we have to become more aggressive at the local level. We're very fortunate that we have great partners at the local level and within municipalities. And it's just getting creative with our partners to win projects.
In Midlands and Columbia, I mean, you've got it, Carl, this is my turn, but you got it kind of easy because you're within arm's reach of the State House and you get the resources that you want because of the capital city. But when you listen to Brittany and also think about kind of the demographic of South Carolina, and Boeing is, you could argue, is out in the sticks, close to Charleston, but it's out in the sticks. So that's kind of a rural development that has bridged some things.
The manufacturing in the Low Country is changing so much. The face of the Low Country, with Volvo being 30 miles outside of Charleston, obviously Boeing in North Charleston, absolutely. That the stigma of rural, that rural-urban divide is getting a little thinner, if you will. But Brittany, when in the upstate is growing so fast, the I-85 corridor, which you're right across that's exactly right. So there's a lot of synergy between North and South Carolina in economic development, especially in those rural areas. The Low Country in eastern North Carolina still got pockets of prosperity, but the eastern parts of the state are hurting a little bit worse than the western parts.
You know, I know we've talked about that for a long time, that western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina, obviously neighbors and adjacent, literally butt up against each other. And we've talked about the hope and the promise that there could be more development there. Has that time come? Couldn't you honestly reach across the border that's not that far away and reach into Greenville or Greer or Spartanburg? I mean, is that happening now?
Yes, we say in Henderson County we have 1 foot in the upstate and 1 foot in the mountains. And what I mean by that is very much the backbone of our economy is advanced manufacturing, which is the synergy of a BMW in the Greer and upstate communities. But we have the cultural amenities that attract so many companies to our area that are synonymous with an Asheville in the western North Carolina. And so that is for us how we kind of bridge that rural-urban divide. We play off both of those strengths and can develop our economy that way. So it's something we're very aware of, and we hope to partner with our friends in upstate South Carolina to build a healthy corridor along I-26.
You know, and that's a good point too. Are you surprised that North Carolina has not been, again, this is my point of view, has not been more successful in leveraging South Carolina's success around automotive and aerospace?
You know, it gets tricky because a lot of the suppliers have the just-in-time specification. They need to be within 60 miles, and that's our sweet spot. We are right on that threshold of BMW, and so that's how we are successful in the western part of the state, is being that proximity to BMW. I think when you start thinking about the rest of North Carolina, that's where the challenge would lie.
Not so much.
Yeah.
Carl, specific to South Carolina, I have about 30 seconds left. SCANA and Santee Cooper continue to go through the very painful public process of not just finger pointing on who let this cost control get out of control, but how much is that? How much is the cost of energy increased, and how much does that impact economic development prowess?
It's a component of the overall picture. We're about 30% higher right now than the rest of the state.
Is that prohibitive?
In some particular cases, on high energy users, absolutely. So it's we're ready for this discussion to move to the next level. I think the General Assembly is trying to tackle it right now. It may be punted until the first part of next legislative session before we have some closure.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Stay with us. We're going to meet our guest in a moment. Speaking of the upstate in western North Carolina, Leah Ashburn is CEO of Highland Brewing Company in Asheville. We're going to be talking about not just the beer industry, which clearly is sexy and fun, but the business of it, the numbers by it. And also following very soon, he is the commissioner of the Atlantic Coast Conference. Everyone loves the ACC, right? Well, John Swofford will be here talking about many things around schools, around athletics, and around academics. John Swofford coming up on Carolina Business Review. Asphalt, concrete, cement, aggregates all sound decidedly low-tech, but don't be fooled. It's big business for sure, but it's also very big raw material business too. There are dozens of stone quarries that dot a map of the Carolinas. Last year, this major construction supply line firm sold almost $4 billion in aggregates and related rock services and products. Joining us again, Martin Marietta Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer, Ward Nye. Mr. Chairman, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Ward, gosh, you're having a good year, right?
We had a good year last year. We think we'll have a better one this year.
I mean, when you look at this and you think, yeah, this is great, we're wonderful growth through acquisitions, but your top line is growing. The first time you've hit $1 billion in EBITDA or something related, something above that. Do you start thinking about how you model for a slowdown or how you protect this growth that you have?
You think about it, but here's the odd thing. We are doing well. We're doing very well economically. We're seeing record profits. We saw that last year. We're not seeing record volumes. So from a shipment perspective, here's some numbers to keep in the back of your mind. In 2006, we produced and sold 205 million tons of stone. At the absolute bottom of the market, 125. Last year, about 160. But here's what's notable. During that downturn, we added about 27 million tons of product through different acquisitions. So if we're looking where we are through a cycle, we're not someplace peaky relative to volumes. We are relative to profitability because of positioning and what we're doing to drive costs down in our business.
So it's a productivity, would you say, that you've gotten good at that?
There has been good productivity and there's been good geographic positioning within our business. We feel like this cycle is extended. We think it keeps going. We think it's slow growth, but that's certainly what we've seen over the last several years.
How long would you expect this cycle to continue with this kind of momentum?
The way that we see it right now, if we're looking at housing starts in the United States at 1.2 million, we feel like this cycle ought to go up to 1.4. Keep in mind, 1.5 million starts is a 50-year average. We're really not seeing yet the benefits from the Fixing America Surface Transportation Act or the FAST Act. We think we will see more of that this year. So if we think about our volumes, 45% of what we sell ought to find its way to highways, bridges, roads, and streets. Last year it was more like 40%. About 15% of what we do ought to find its way to housing. Last year's around 21%, but it's still on very subdued volumes. And about 30% ought to be some form of non-residential. And we see that continuing to be good, but oddly enough, we see bits of shift in that. We're seeing office, retail doing better right now. We're seeing malls actually doing much more slowly work right now, in large part because people are buying like this and not buying in the shopping centers as much.
Sure. Carl?
Congratulations on the great year last year and projections this year. So when times are good, when business is steady and improving, what keeps you up at night from a corporate standpoint?
Primarily the thing that you're most focused on is taking good care of your workforce. Part of what we were pleased with last year, as Chris mentioned, we had record profits. We had the best safety year in our company's history. Great. I'm proud to say it's safer to work in a Martin Marietta quarry than it is to work in retail in some instances. But I recognize that if we don't do what we do well and do it carefully, it can be a dangerous business. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. So making sure that we're doing things the right way from that perspective, it doesn't keep me up at night, but it keeps us awfully focused at night. That's probably the best way to think of it.
Right.
Brittany?
Speaking of workforce, how do you think companies can successfully tap into a K-12 environment to build the pipeline of workforce?
I think that's an important question. And number one, staying engaged locally is vitally important for what we do. We have 400 operations across the United States. It's a heavy industry. And we recognize that we have the capacity to impact a community for good or not. We're focused on making sure we do it for good. Staying involved in our local school systems is important. The other piece of it that we find great utility in is making sure we're tied into community colleges as well. Because as we look at the workforce that we have, not just for today, but the workforce that we're going to have for the next 15, 20 years, making sure we have good drivers, good welders, people who are skilled with their hands, who are not just looking for a job. We're looking for people who would like to make a career in our industry. And typically when we get people to come to work for us, they end up staying there for a career. But being involved K-1 or through 12, but making sure you're involved not just in the colleges and universities, but in community colleges, we have found to be impactful to our business.
Great.
You have a front row center to transportation infrastructure, the growth of it. It's clearly on the dockets of not just the General Assemblies in the Carolinas ward, but also businesses. I mean, we're choking on traffic in many of our metros. How would you model out the next 10 years when it comes to transportation infrastructure from 2 points? From a financing, how do we do that in a public finance way? And then how do we find that balance of folks that say, yeah, we need a new interstate, we want to expand it, but not in my backyard?
Look, I think we're going to have to look at it, just as you said, funding and financing, and they're two different things. So from a federal level, we're going to have to think of it differently in the fullness of time than a gas tax. We've had a gas tax in place in the United States for the last 25 years that has not moved and it has not been indexed, and more car manufacturers are going to build electric vehicles. So using that to fund highway transportation long term is going to be a very difficult proposition for the country. You can say the same thing relative to states. Now, will you see increased use of public-private partnership for financing? I think you probably will. I think the big issue with that is when you hear public-private partnership, the primary thing to remember is that's principally going to be toll roads. Toll roads will clearly have a role as we look at transportation infrastructure across the United States, but it won't work everywhere.
So hands down, we'll definitely see more toll projects proposed.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think you will see more multi-prime jobs being bid as well. You're going to put more and more pressure and responsibility on the private sector to come forward with good, engineered, ready-to-go projects that DOTs can then take and run. But you made a very good point, and that is South Carolina clearly approached this in a very clear-eyed way last year. They actually raised their gas tax. They're doing that over the next 5 years. That's going to put about $620 million out there, filling almost $1 billion hole that South Carolina had. North Carolina right now is really putting out good work too. The delivery and efficiency of projects in North Carolina. About a year ago, we had about $2.3 billion worth of projects in backlog. Right now, it's down to about $1.6 billion. By the end of the fiscal year, they want it to be down to $1 billion. And part of what I like about that is we have quarries in big parts of the state. We have quarries in small parts of the state too, Brittany. And what I'm seeing is we look at that 10-year program in North Carolina and the program in South Carolina, you're seeing rural parts of both those states getting those funds, because that's going to be important. Just as we've seen with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and what that can do in eastern North Carolina, opening up these avenues for commerce in the rural parts of the states, but also making sure people in Charlotte and Raleigh and Columbia and upstate can move around is going to be vital to competitiveness.
Do you see more local communities taking a bigger stand in creating their own opportunities with infrastructure? I mean, the feds they've not addressed the gas tax since '86 or whatever that number was. South Carolina did so. North Carolina always has had a priority for infrastructure. Do you see the local markets taking a bigger role, the Charlottes and the Raleighs and the Columbias and Charlestons?
We are, and the primary way that they're doing is the way that I think both these states will have to think about it more, and that is really through varying degrees of debt financing and looking at bonding. And what we've seen when local initiatives have gone to the ballot, when you're voting on traffic in your area or yours or mine, it passes about 75% of the time. I mean, that's what we see in the Carolinas. More importantly, that's what we see across the United States as well. And I think local communities and states, because of varying degrees of inaction from the federal government, have certainly taken more of this on themselves. If we look at our largest states, Texas, Colorado, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, every one of those states over the last 2 or 3 years has put considerably more money to their local infrastructure. But then to your point, as we go down and look at very specific MSAs, they've done that as well. If we go back to last November's elections, it was hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bond initiatives that were passed in local MSAs to do exactly what you're talking about, Carl.
Brittany?
Looking into the crystal ball, you talked about electric vehicles earlier, but autonomous driving, how do you think that plays into infrastructure in the future?
It'll be fascinating to see how many cars people can put on the road and do it safely. And really what that does to lane travels as well. We are going to have a front row seat, all of us, to see how that works. That'll be fascinating, not just from an on-road perspective, but from an off-road perspective as well. Because again, you're going to look at efficiency from that. There's going to be a big safety debate that will come from that as we watch technology evolve. But part of what we're going to have to see is how far can cars be together in an autonomous circumstance? How far can they be apart? What happens to lane width and otherwise, particularly in the Carolinas? We've got roads in North Carolina and South Carolina that from a DOT maintenance perspective take up far more lane miles of maintenance than almost any other state in the country, with the exception of Texas. At the same time, if we look at the spend that we're seeing in these states on a mile perspective, North Carolina, let's say, call it $60,000 per annum lane mile. Most other states that we would compete with, South Carolina, same picture, closer to 200. So the debate around autonomous vehicles, how we take care of our roads, the type of spend that we have will be a very dynamic conversation.
Doesn't this, though, Ward, doesn't this force the debate for mass transit more and more? Won't that start bubbling up?
I think you will certainly hear more of it. I think it's hard for people to let go of their vehicles. It's a fascinating thing to see. And even when you travel to San Francisco and you look at the sheer number of people who are riding BART every day, it's a lot of people, but if you look at the people driving their cars across the San Francisco Bay Bridge, it's still a lot of people.
There's a lot of lanes on that bridge. So let's come back to the financing model here. And I'm sorry to have to keep talking about public policy, but you know it so well because obviously it's the end part of your business. So the funding of these roads and the expansion and the infrastructure, federal government has proposed that they're going to do less infrastructure spending, that the states are going to have to pick up more, but the federal government wants to be part of that process. So, and this might be a question for the treasurers of the states, does North Carolina have a lot of wiggle room in inventory about issuing public debt for this?
I think that is going to be a conversation that I would anticipate the governor and the legislature and Treasurer Falwell to have. And I think that's going to be an important conversation for us to have, because if you look at the way it works at a federal level or other states, Garvey bonding tends to be a big piece of that.
Right.
At the same time, if we look at the way that type of bonding works, for example, in North Carolina, 65% of the roads in our state would not be eligible for that from that type of a program. So I think if the federal government is going to put more onus on the states to deal with that, I think we're likely to see proposals from DOT or others that start looking very sensibly at how can we issue more debt in this state responsibly to make sure that we're dealing with this. Because again, from a competitiveness perspective, if you look at the miss that we had in the Toyota Mazda transaction, clearly infrastructure is going to be a piece of it. I think Brittany raises a very good point when she spoke earlier about supply chain and how that works, or in some instances how that doesn't work. But we're not going to bring all those pieces together until we can see and really flush out the way these corridors work. And that's what we're seeing in our business. More and more volume are not going necessarily to projects. You're looking at corridors, 85, 95, 77, 40. And by the way, that's the same story across the United States, 35 in Texas, 25 up and down the Front Range in Colorado. These corridors of commerce are what's really going to disproportionately drive that, and probably the conversation on bonding.
We have about a minute left. Question?
We talked about mass transportation, but we really haven't seen an investment in rail or any other. We have the port. South Carolina's growing inland ports in the upstate as well as in Dillon County. Those type of investments as well, would you consider? I mean, more money coming for those type of infrastructure projects?
I think you will clearly see more of that. I think that's back to the conversation. A lot of that's going to be very locally driven, because you see places like the Triangle who would like to see more rail going between those communities. At the same time, I think getting a huge amount of state money coming into that is probably going to be in varying degrees a challenge. Of course, from our perspective, we don't mind that so much because there's a lot of ballast that has to go under all that rail
Ballast.
going
Good
across.
word.
Isn't that
Good
a
word.
tough word?
Chairman Johnny Harris of Lincoln Harris said there's no way the triangle, this is what he said recently, no way the triangle is going to get Amazon because there was a miss on connecting the triangle through rail.
You know,
And do it in 10 seconds, can
I
you?
think the Triangle's got a good shot at that. I think we bring a lot educationally, culturally, and geographically to that conversation. I think part of the thing that we need to wonder out loud is how much does Amazon want to be on the ground up driving some of that?
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that's a debate that has yet to be had.
Yeah. Ward, thanks for being on the program again. Why don't you run for governor or something where you could take all of this great exposure and bring it to bear?
You need to talk to Mrs. Nye about that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, amen. Thank you for being here. Good to see you again. Thank you. Brittany, welcome. Please come back.
No,
Okay.
Thank you.
Carl, always thank you for always coming back.
Yeah,
It's nice to
thank
see
you for having me. I appreciate it.
Until next weekend, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, Bearings, Grant Thornton, Novant Health, Sunoco, Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina, and by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.